I asked the choir to sing those two anthems this morning to remind us that life's goal, heaven, is not just about pearly gates and streets of gold and crowns and being reunited with those we've loved and lost. Heaven is about being with Jesus, experiencing God in His fullness in a way that we just can't on this planet. For followers of Jesus, God has used a host of different people to bring us to Him and to keep us going on this journey to heaven, which is the Christian life. And among those people, for many of us, were moms. I am very aware that today is Mother's Day, and Mother's Day is not easy for many people. And if you are one of those folks for whom Mother's Day is a struggle, thank you for being here today. I greatly appreciate your presence. On this day that we recognize mothers, we also need to beware of over-exalting mothers. What does that mean? Perhaps you've seen this plaque or this poster or this bumper sticker that says, God could not be everywhere, and therefore He made mothers. I appreciate the sentiment, but I have a couple of problems with this. To begin with, God is everywhere. That's part of what it means to be God. But also, I think this is an impossible burden to lay on moms. You've got to be like God. And there is a related problem. I think over-exalting moms on a day like today can also result in taking them even more for granted the rest of the year. They can become just a pair of hands at my beck and call. Mom, can you do this? Mom, can you take me there? Mom, have you seen my math book? Anybody been there? It's easy to forget that this woman can have dreams and needs of her own that she has subsumed under her family for their sake. She can feel taken for granted. She can, after a while, actually feel invisible. I don't know if you've ever felt that way as a mom, but we're going to look at a Bible story today about a woman who may have very much felt that way. In Genesis chapter 16, if you would like to, you can read along with me. I'm reading from the NIV this morning. Before they were known as Abraham and Sarah, they were called Abram and Sarai. God changed their names later. The story we're going to read is before their names were changed. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian maidservant named Hagar. So she said to Abram, "The Lord has kept me from having children. Go sleep with my maidservant. Perhaps I can build a family through her." We're a little put off by this practice. Apparently at that time, it was not unheard of for a man to build his progeny from a servant girl of his wife. Abram agreed to what Sarai said. So after Abram had been living in Canaan 10 years, Sarai, his wife, took her Egyptian maidservant Hagar, gave her to her husband to be his wife. He slept with Hagar, and she conceived. When she knew that she was pregnant, he began to despise her mistress. She began to despise her mistress. Then Sarai said to Abram, "You are responsible for the wrong I am suffering. I put my servant in your arms, and now she knows she is pregnant. She despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me." "Your servant is in your hands," Abram said. "Do with her whatever you think best." Then Sarai mistreated Hagar, So she fled from her. Hagar is an Egyptian immigrant. She is running away from a household where her body has been used to produce offspring for an infertile couple. I want to be careful about forcing 21st century thinking and expectations way back to a 20th century BC couple. But I do notice that in their conversation, Abram and Sarai refer to her as the maid, the servant. They never use her name. In that culture, and in Hagar's position in the household, she was essentially property, which means she was something less than a real person. And when Sarai mistreated her, she left. I'm not sure she knew what she wanted, but she knew what she did not want, and that was to be treated like a non-person, like she was invisible. She didn't really know what she needed until there in the desert by herself, she met God. Back to Genesis 16, beginning at 7. The angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. It was the spring that is beside the road to Shur. And he said, Hagar. He called her by name. Servant of Sarai. Her purpose was secondary to her personhood. Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going? I'm running away from my mistress Sarai, she answered. Then the angel of the Lord said to her, go back to your mistress and submit to her. The angel added, I will increase your descendants that they will be too numerous to count. And then the angel gave a prophecy about the amazing things that this young man would grow to become. Having heard this, Hagar gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her. You are the God who sees me. For she said, I have now seen the one who sees me. Hagar, who might have felt insignificant and misunderstood, is actually a very significant person. Hagar has the longest conversation of any woman in the Old Testament with God. And she is also the only person in the Bible to give God a name. Others had identified certain objects as being representative of God and what he's like. She gave him a name based on her experience with him and where he met her need. At this point in history, God is gradually revealing himself to human beings. He calls himself Elohim, the Creator, Yahweh, the I Am who makes covenant, El Shaddai, the Almighty. And these are all descriptions of what God is like, his character, his nature. When Hagar met him, she discovered that he's not only the vast Almighty God, he's also a very personal God, and met her where she was at her point of need. And so she said, I have seen the God who sees me. God sees me. What difference does it make in our lives that there is a God who sees me? I've become convinced that we all have a fundamental need to be seen. Little girl perched on top of the sliding board, and she looks out and says, Mommy, watch me. And she'll keep saying it until Mom actually watches her. It doesn't matter if every other mother in the park is looking up there. She wants her mom to watch her. I think it means when you watch me, when you see me, it validates me. It means I am someone of worth. I am someone who has value. A woman from a church in Toronto writes this: I used to help in the play school that my son went to when he was 3. I was on duty one day, and I sat most of the morning with Matt's little friend, Joshua. And Joshua was a very active little boy. But this morning, he was very, very still and very, very focused. And he was building a rocket out of toilet rolls and yogurt pots. And he built this magnificent rocket. And he had just finished it when it came time for the end of play school. And all the kids were packing up, and he packed up, but he had his rocket. And everybody went, and Joshua was still there with his rocket. And finally his mom came flying in, and she was obviously very late. And he stood there so excited, and he held up his rocket to show her, and he said several times, "Mom, look at my rocket! Mom, look at my rocket!" And she never gave his rocket a glance. She basically just said to him, "Hurry up, Joshua, we need to go." And she started heading out of the door. And he trailed along behind with his rocket. And as I watched him leave, I saw his shoulders slump, and I saw his rocket go down by his side, and he was just trailing it along, hanging limply there. And it no longer looked magnificent. It actually looked pretty worthless, which is just what Joshua felt. Because all Joshua wanted his mom to do was to look at his rocket. We have a need to be seen. But having that need to be seen met depends on how someone sees me. Long after Hagar's time, God says in Psalm 139:16, "Before I formed you, I saw you. My eyes saw your unformed body." God saw us before anybody else did. Now, I don't know how that makes you think, the idea that God's watching you. There's a famous plaque with these words: "Christ is the head of this house, the unseen guest at every meal, and the silent listener to every conversation." It may be that that plaque gave you comfort to know that Jesus is silently there with you. It may have been the thing that made you stay on the straight and narrow, because the thinking is, I'm watching you. You watch yourself. What's it like to have God watching you? From God's perspective, it's not this. His perspective comes to us in Jeremiah 24, for example, where he says, "My eyes will watch over them for good." In the context here, the people of Israel had been taken to faraway Babylon, more than 1,000 miles, almost 1,000 miles from home. And there in Babylon, the people of Israel are wondering, does God even see us way, way over here? Does he know that we're here? Has he forgotten about us? And that's the context in which God says, "My eyes see them, and I will watch over them for their good." There's also a beautiful verse in Zephaniah chapter 3. There really is a book in the Bible called Zephaniah, short book, in which the prophet says, "He will take great delight in you. He will quiet you with his love." In Matthew 6:6, Jesus said, "Your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you." This, of course, is referring to getting into that prayer closet, being alone with the Lord and being with Him. What reward is there from God in that place and in that time? It's not the crowns. It is His presence and His delight in you. If you've seen the movie Chariots of Fire and remember the runner, Eric Liddell, became an Olympic runner, but early on, he came from a strict Scots background and felt a call as a missionary. But he loved running, and his sister came to him, "Don't you know that God intended you as for missions? Why are you doing this running business?" And he famously said, "Yes, I believe God made me for a purpose, but He also made me fast. And when I run, I feel His pleasure. When I do the thing God made me to do, I feel like He delights in me." Have you found that thing? I want to be careful here because some of us, and this is difficult to say anytime, some of us have experienced an inappropriate kind of father's pleasure that can produce confusion and hurt. That never happens with our Heavenly Father. Never. To be seen by Him does not mean you don't fall. The Bible doesn't say no sparrow falls. The Bible does say He sees even the sparrow that falls. When a 7-year-old finally gets those training wheels off and is taking off on his own, there's no guarantee he's not going to fall. But Dad will be watching him to come to help when that fall happens. Falling is a part of life, and God does not stop everything that hurts us, especially when we choose to do things our own way. Even then, when we step outside what's best for us, God still sees us. And when we get hurt, and when other people get hurt, God doesn't necessarily prevent the hurt from happening, but He always provides the possibility for healing, maybe even much later than when it happened, because He sees us and watches for us. I don't know if the thought of God seeing you all the time makes you cringe or if it gives you courage. It gave Hagar courage. She went back and stayed with Abram and Sarai. I want to take just a brief side note. It says that Sarai mistreated Hagar. This godly woman, woman of faith, hero of the faith, mother of Isaac, was an abuser. Can that happen in godly families? It can. The Bible doesn't record this episode as a prescription. This is what you should do. The Bible simply describes what happened. Abuse should never be part of a family that is committed to knowing the Lord and being watched over by the Lord. Nor does it require, as Hagar did, that the abuser stay in the abusive situation. It doesn't require that. The Bible simply records what happened. But in the middle of her pain, Hagar met God. The pain drove her to a place where she could meet God. How about you? Is your pain stopping you from seeing God? Like Mary in the garden, who was crying so hard she didn't even recognize Jesus, and He was standing right there. Is your pain doing that? Perhaps the most telling story of being seen happened in the courtyard of the high priest. Jesus, having been arrested, had been taken to the high priest and now was being led out to another trial. And Peter has just denied even knowing Jesus. And then in Luke, we read this: just as Peter was speaking, the rooster crowed, and the Lord turned and looked at Peter. What do you imagine that look was saying to Peter? I knew you would fail, Peter. You let me down. I'm done with you. Absolutely not. I believe what that look said, I knew, Peter, that you would fail me. I love you, Peter. And more than that, I know that you still love me. I'm looking at you, and you're looking back at me, and we're still in business. Have you ever wondered, reading that account, how it was that we find out that Peter looked back at Jesus? It's because Peter said, he looked at me, and I looked back at him. In that moment, the shame was overwhelming, and he left. But when Peter so badly failed, disappointed himself, denied Jesus, betrayed Jesus, momentarily took his eyes off Jesus, Jesus still was looking at him. God sees you today, and he sees you with a look of love. And you can look back at him, not literally, but with the eyes of faith, looking at his word. And what difference will that make? What difference does it make that God sees you today as you drive your car away from this building? What difference does it make that God sees you when you go to bed tonight? What difference will it make that God sees you when you get up tomorrow morning? As you live your life, as you do your work as a mom, as you have experienced something painful as a mom, God sees you. Go with knowing that. Pray with me.